So it's been a very long couple of days since iRacing updated the NASCAR NextGen car, but in this video I'm going to actually show you everything that I have figured out over the 1,000 laps that I've turned in the last probably 36 hours. And I'm even going to show you the brand new setup guide that I built for this car and where you can get it for free. What's up, everybody? Thomas Brandon here. Thank you very much as always for joining me, and like I said, we're going to be diving back into the NASCAR Next Gen car today. Now, like I said just a second ago, it's been about 2 days since iRacing dropped the update on these cars, and since then I have turned probably 1,000 laps at minimum in this car, working everything out, testing everything, whether it's the springs, you know, the ARBs, the arms, the nose weight, cross weight, tire wear, you know, the aero platform, which is huge on this car. You name it, I've been testing it, cross testing it, retesting it, and I finally got together the new setup guide that I was talking about for this car, so that way you can go out and start either adjusting or building your own setups and have something that will not only be hopefully competitive but comfortable. And that, you're going to find out in this video, is really the key with these cars now. So the number one thing that I've noticed with this car and all the laps that I have been turning since they updated it is that the increased power and reduced downforce is a huge factor, which obviously we expected. If you go from 550 to 670 horsepower and then you cut the rear spoiler down to 4 inches, that's going to have a huge effect on the car. But more importantly, now, because of how the car is, you're seeing a huge difference in things like tire wear, the balance of the car, all kinds of different stuff. I'm going to actually show you some of this in just a second. And when this thing just gets like 10 to 15 laps on it, it starts to slide all over the place. It can be a real handful, and you've got to be good with that throttle. Now, in my opinion, this is a good thing because it makes it a real driver's car. The better you are, the smoother you are, the more consistent you are, the better you should do. It's not like it was before where we just hold it wide open, get into the draft, and then hopefully get a toe for the win. No, with this thing now, you're going to have to drive it and you're going to have to really be smooth with that throttle because, like I said, even after just 10 to 15 laps, this car just starts sliding on the track. Like it does not have the grip like it used to because of the reduced downforce, and then the increased horsepower makes it just that much harder to control once these tires get worn out. So with all of that being said, let's head over to the garage and bring up the setup guide and start diving into this. All right, so here is the new setup guide that I just put together. And the first thing that I did yesterday was I went through and basically just kind of reassured that all of the adjustment breakdowns and stuff like that that I have right now are still the same with this car. So for example, if you stiffen up the right rear spring, does it still have the effect on the exit as it did before? Right, stuff like that. And for the most part, everything is largely still the same, but there are a couple of slight differences now because of this car's independent suspension, and this has a really big effect on the tire wear of the car. If you look at the NASCAR truck or the Xfinity car or even the Gen 6 car, last year's car, one thing that we would always notice with those cars is that you would usually see about a 2-to-1 or even 3-to-1 ratio in terms of tire fall off. And what I mean by that is this: for every 3% that you lost on the right side, you would lose 1% on the left side, right? So, or 2% on the right side, 1% on the left side. So for example, if you went out and you did a 50-lap run and your right side tires were at 60%, your left side tires might be at like 85%, okay? You wore the right sides out way more than you did the left sides. That's not the case anymore, okay? It's not. With this thing, because of the way that this independent suspension is and with the shocks that we've got on it and just everything, now I'm seeing tire wear and all the testing that I've done, it's completely opposite. For example, this was a 60 lap run that I did, okay? And you can see that the left front is at 79% and the right front is at 82. That is completely backwards than anything we've ever seen with the Gen 6 car or the Xfinity or the truck. Also, the left rear is at 80 and the right rear is at 88, 87. And this is not a high crossweight setup. The crossweight on this setup is 54.6. Now obviously it's not low, but if you remember, we would be running like 60% crossweight on these cars, okay, just a week ago, and you would not see tire wear like that. So this car now, because of that added horsepower and that the less downforce, getting this thing balanced is super important. It's absolutely critical because, like I said, after like 10 to 15 laps, you're going to feel this thing sliding around on the track. You just are. You're going to feel it. I mean, you just go into the corner, you can feel it, and it's just sliding. Like, you're really going to have to learn to drive on limit more. I think the first few weeks, we're going to see a lot of cautions on these official races, because drivers it's a completely different car, not only from the version of this that we had just a week ago or a couple days ago with the 550 low horsepower high downforce, but if you look at like the Gen 6 car, for example, that car was way more stuck to the track than this one. Now that does not mean that this is still not glued to the track. It's a lot of different factors, obviously the downforce, but also the tires, because these are lower profile tire. The feel of it when the tires wear is really different as well. So that's something to keep in mind when you are doing this. Okay, so now that we got kind of the house cleaning stuff out of the way, how do we build the setups for these cars? Well, let's actually dive into that right now. So here's the setup guide that I put together, and if you've looked at any of my other setup guides before, it's very similar to those. Okay, obviously the steps are broken down differently because it's a different car, but overall it's the same concept. All right, just a quick little intro on the stuff that you want to do. Now, one thing that I found when working on this car and building setups for it, I discovered that creating a step-by-step process for each adjustment, especially in the beginning when you're figuring this out, once you get more experience or you spend as much time on it like I do, right, and you really learn adjustments inside and out, then you can start deviating from this process where you're just like, okay, well, I know I should be adjusting my springs right now, but I don't need a spring adjustment, I need an ARB adjustment. Like, once you get good enough to determine that, then you can start doing that. But in the beginning, I've got this kind of laid out to where you can go through step by step and you're like, okay, this is where I'm at in terms of the steps, so this is what I need to be adjusting, just to make it a little bit easier for those of you who are just now starting out, especially with these cars. Okay, so first thing that you need to understand is we've got, there's basically 3 steps, like always. You got step 1, which is going to be determined by the track. With this, it's going to be basically your gear ratio and your caster. Step 2, which is going to be your camber and your tires, okay, which is another one that's pretty much track determined. So your camber and your tire pressures really, really important with these cars, okay. And then step 3 is going to be everything else, essentially, which is your drivability, feel, wear, comfort, all that stuff like that. Now, for me, I have my own baseline setups that I build from. Okay, so I've got a baseline now for the intermediate tracks that I put together. I've got a baseline for the short tracks that, and I just build from those. What I would recommend you doing is do something like that, or you could just use the iRacing setup as a baseline. But the iRacing stuff is pretty good. It's not horrible, right? It's not the best, but it's not the worst. Okay, it's pretty good. You can definitely build from the iRacing setup. I've built from iRacing's setups before. All right, so you can have success doing that. All right, so you just want to have a baseline to work from. Now here's the thing, once you build a few setups, you'll have a library that you can go back to and use. So for example, we're at Kentucky right now. Kentucky is actually kind of similar to Texas in the sense that you know, you've got this one corner that's really wide, but it's kind of flat and you have to really slow down to go through it. And then you've got this other end of the track that's really fast where you just kind of let off and then you can just zip right through it. Okay, it's very similar to Texas. So the next time we go to Texas, guess what? I'm probably going to be using this Kentucky setup as my baseline, okay, to start from. Now, is it going to work? I don't know, but I'm going to try it first, okay? So that's what you can do once you start getting more and more setups, is you can go back and you can use previous ones as baselines to build from, all right? So first thing, determine your gear and caster. This is pretty straightforward, you guys. So what I found with the gear ratios, and you know, right now you can, you know what I mean? It's not like the Xfinity or the truck where it's like it's locked in. You can basically run whatever gear you want. Remember, these cars do not have grill tape, okay? The biggest contributing factor to the temperature of your engine is going to be the RPMs. All right, the more RPMs you turn, the hotter that the engine's going to get. All right, now I have found the best range in all of the stuff that I've looked at so far, and all the testing that I've done, and all the data that I've looked at in Motec using my maths and stuff like that, that if you can get the car to kind of like 8,700 to 9,000 in that range at the end of the straightaway, then you're pretty much there on gear. All right. Now, I know with these cars, a lot of people have talked about the potential of downshifting in corners and stuff like that, and then upshifting, and I tried that a ton, and with the car the way it is now, it seems way slower. Now that we've got more horsepower, we don't really need to be shifting in these things. Maybe on short tracks or something, but on these bigger ones, just find the right gear and go with it. All right. That gear, keep in mind though, when you're at these tracks, don't forget about the draft, okay? Because there will be other cars around, you will be getting a tow, and that RPM will increase. So if you set your gear ratio to where you're hitting 9,100 RPMs at the end of the straightaway by yourself, and then all of a sudden you're running in a pack, you're going to get up to 94, 9,500 RPMs. All right, so just keep that in mind, okay? The caster on this is actually pretty simple because it's a pretty narrow range. The highest that you can go to on the right front is 11. The lowest that you can go to on the left front is 8. So you've only got a maximum of 3 degrees of caster split. All right. And to be honest, the caster split with this car does not have as big of effect in terms of making the car kind of dive, you know, into the corner as the old car, as the Gen 6 car. It just doesn't. It's very fine. You can feel the difference, but it's not as noticeable as the other cars, okay? At least for me. Let me clarify. At least for me, okay? So those are the first two things. Once you do that, then the next thing that you want to do is going to be your camber and your tire pressures. Now, what I do for tire pressures is actually pretty simple, okay? So I will start off with on the right sides, no matter where I'm at, okay? No matter what track it is, wherever I'm at, like ovals, obviously. Road course is a little bit different, but wherever we're at, I will set the right sides to the minimum. And then what I do is I just multiply that number by 0.6, and that will usually give me, I think it's 27 pounds, okay? 27 PSI. So I usually start off with pretty much the same tire pressures at like all the 1.5 mile tracks. I really do. I start off with basically the same. It's like 45 on the right, 27s on the left, and then I will adjust that accordingly. Usually I try to keep the front and the rear the same. With this car, that is not the case. I have been changing it quite a bit. A lot of times the fronts and rears will be different. And the best way to look at your tire pressures in terms of adjustment is you want to look at the middle number, okay? If the middle number, right, and keep in mind, this is based on the fact that you've got your cambers correct, right? So once you've got your cambers correct, then you want to start really looking at your tire pressures. If you've got your cambers pretty much dialed in, and then you notice that your middle tire temp is actually hotter or higher than the outside and the inside, that means you've got too much air, all right? That means that inside or the middle of that tire is bulging, okay? On the opposite end, if the middle is lower than the outside and the inside, right, it has to be lower than both, that means that you have too little air. So the tire is actually, it's the opposite. Okay, so the outsides are actually getting more contact and the middle doesn't have enough pressure because the tire is low pressure, and so it's not getting the contact that the outsides are getting. And so that's a way that you can actually get your tire pressures dialed in. Now, in terms of, like an adjustment for, making the car turn better or something like that, that is completely up to you. Some people like the cars to have a lot of stagger, which is basically just higher right side pressures and left side pressures, so where the car just really turns on its own. As you can see here, I've got more than 23 and a half in the right rear difference, right? That's a big difference. So it's really up to you on what feels good. It really is. And then once I kind of get it to what feels good, then I start fine tuning the pressures based on what the tire temps are telling me. Okay. Now on the cambers, same thing. You want to just get these things as close to even as possible. Now it used to be and we still do. I still do this on the Xfinity in the truck. On the left front, you just maxed out the left front camber, because the left front camber, the more that you have, the better it helps the car turn in the center of the corner. And you don't care if you're burning it, you don't care if you're only using part of the tire, because the reward outweighs the risk, because that left front tire hardly wears. Even when you've got the camber maxed out, it doesn't wear that much. That's not the case anymore. This left front tire wears just as much as the rest of them. It really does. So what I started doing was I really tinkered with this left front camber, trying to figure out if there was, should we run more than the tire temps are telling us? Should we try to get it as close to perfect as possible? What seems to be that zone? For me, as long as my middle and outside are close, and I try to keep them pretty close. If we look at that long run here, you can see I had 215 on the outside, 211 on the middle, and then 176 on the inside. If I can be within about 7 degrees on the middle and outside, then my left front camber is good. The other 3 tires, I want to keep those pretty dang close. So I try to keep about a 10 to 15 degree temperature split, closer to 10 hopefully. And you can see here on the right front, and like I said, this was after 60 laps. On the right front, we have 254, 247, 243. So we're basically right there. We're 11 degrees. Here we had 219, 218, and 214. I mean, that's awesome. That's only a 5-degree split from inside to outside. And then over here, 243 to 244 and 251. So 8 degrees, right? So that's what you're looking for with those cambers. Once you've got that, then you can go out and start really working on the setup, like getting the adjustments for drivability, comfort, speed, that type of thing. Okay, so now that we are on to our chassis adjustments now, and this is where we're going to start diving into everything else, right? So now we've got the springs, the shocks, the ARBs, the ARB arms, the nose weight, the cross weight, right? The preload, all of that stuff. This is where people really start to get confused, because you go into a corner, the car's loose, and then now it's, well, what do I adjust? I've got all these different adjustments. What do I adjust? And this is where I said that step-by-step process can really come into play, because it just makes things much, much more simple. Now, in the old car, and even in the truck and the Xfinity, the main goal of those cars is to seal off the car, get the splitter completely sealed off so you have as little air as possible going under the car. This increases the downforce, it also decreases the drag, and it increases your speed, because the less drag that you have, the faster the car is. Just like a half an inch difference on the front splitter can equal 1 to 2 miles per hour in overall top speed at the end of the straightaway. That's a lot. Okay, that's a big deal with those other cars. With this car, so if we actually take a look at the front end here, you can see that we've got our nose, our splitter, and it goes down, and it actually steps up and then comes back down. You'll never get this splitter on the ground. You're never going to get this part on the ground. It's not possible, okay, unless you break something. But what I've discovered is this. You do want to get these corners as close to the ground as possible. You do want to seal off these corners as best you can. Now, if you can do that, then you're going to let in air through here, and that's a good thing, because then what happens is we can actually that's what gives us the air out of the diffuser, and that's what's going to give us the most downforce on the car. This diffuser is going to be kind of like your main downforce creator, and we'll cover more about the rake and the tilt and all that stuff here in just a sec, but that's what you want to try to do. So what I do is I will try to get my left front corner set. Okay, before I start adjusting my springs or anything, I want to find out what's that ride height that I want my left front corner at. And essentially, you want it to basically be as close to the ground as possible. Now, we do have those rub blocks, so just drop it down. Once it's hitting the rub block, raise it up until it just stops hitting the rub block, and then, okay, that you found your point. Then what I do is I basically have, it's almost like a formula, okay? Where it's like 0.2 to 0.4 is what I use. So if this is at 0.9, you can see right here we have 1.1. That's 0.2 inches. All right. If we look back here, this is almost 1.1, so 0.2. And then if we look from left to right, we have basically 1.1 to 1.4. That's 0.3. Okay, so that's kind of how I determine where to set the corners on the car. Now, keep in mind, that's how I determine it in the beginning. I do adjust it more later, but I actually use Motec to determine my optimal ride heights and rake. All right, for you, the best way to do it is going to be kind of figure out what feels good to you, go out and turn some laps, and then you're going to have to experiment. What I'll tell you is this: if you tilt the car too much, meaning if you have the right side, above the left side too much, the car's you're gonna get too much air, under that right front corner. But not only that, the air that's coming in underneath is going to escape out the side. It's not gonna use that diffuser as much, so you're not going to generate as much downforce, and the car is going to feel loose. You'll know when you're off on your ride heights, because this thing, it's like the rear diffuser stalls and it's not generating that downforce anymore, and that rear end will just come around. So that's why I start with these numbers, and then I build my setup, and then I'll fine tune the ride height when I know the car feels good, because that's how I can tell whether or not I'm, getting more or less out of the diffuser, okay, or the front end there. All right, so get those ride heights at least close to where you want. They don't have to be exact, but get them close. All right, once you've got them close, then you can actually go out, turn some laps, and establish that baseline. Now, for me personally, when I'm working on my baseline, I will, like I said, I will get those ride heights set, and then the next thing I do is I turn all of these shock settings to 5. I put them all at 5, just right down the middle, okay? Shocks are the last thing that I tune, so I put them all to 5, and the first step in terms of adjustments is going to be the springs. I'm going to adjust the springs first, and I'm going to start with my right rear spring. Now, the reason I start with my right rear spring is because when you go into the corner, if your right rear is too stiff, you're going to know it pretty fast. The car's going to spin, okay? This is why I talk about it being good to have a baseline to run off of, or you can just use the iRacing setup, because you know that they've gotten it pretty close. People are going to actually race with those setups, so now you know that you've got something that works pretty well. If you're just starting from scratch, it might take you a while, okay? So like I said, even though I build all my own setups, I have baselines that I build from, because it saves me a lot of time. You can set these springs, like on the right rear, you can go from 400 pounds to 4,600 pounds. That's a lot of options, okay? And it goes by 25-pound increments. That it could take you a while to figure that out, right? So get a baseline, right? Get out there, turn some laps. If the car's loose, all right, if you go to turn in and just kind of sliding around, then soften up that right rear spring until you get that thing feeling good, okay? Another thing to note is that, have a set, diameter, or a setting for your front and rear ARBs. So for me, when I'm building my setups, I start with my nose weight all the way back. I have my cross weight usually around 53 to 54%. I have my front ARB is always at 2 inches when I start. The ARB arm is always at 3. on the front, and then the rear is always a 1.375, and the arm is always a 3. That's, I have those are the same every single time when I'm building from a baseline, because I want to get, or I want to have as many variables at a controlled level. So that way when I adjust my springs, right, when I go into the corner, I'm just focusing on my springs. I'm not focusing on, is it my spring or is it my ARB, right? Is it my shock or is it my tire pressure? No, I'm just focusing on my spring. I adjust it until it's correct. Once the car is good, then I move on. Okay, that's how I do it. I set this guide up for you to do the same thing. All right, it just makes it much easier. Once you have the right rear set, then go to the left front spring. Okay, the reason you want to go to the left front is the left front you use a ton. I showed you on the tire wear, you actually use it quite a bit. But not only that, the left front spring is super important for controlling the aero profile of the car through the corner. All right, so when you go into the corner, because of this independent suspension that we've got on these cars, you want that car to plant, right? You don't want it to slide, you want it to plant. You want that nose to stick, and you also want it to, drop set and hold, right? You don't want the left front rolling up, right? And you got air going underneath it or anything like that. You also don't want it so stiff that the right front drops and the left front just stays, right? So you want to get it to where it sets that nose. I use the left front to do that. For me, 1,000 pounds of spring split, meaning that if my right front's 4,600, I'll start with the left front at 3,600. That seems like a good starting point for me, okay, in terms of building my setup. All right, and then I'll adjust accordingly, okay. Once I've got that left front spring set, okay, now the car's, I can feel it kind of diving into the corner the way that I want. It's holding the nose the way that I want it. Then I move on to the next spring. All right, the next spring is the left rear, okay, and this I'm going to look at on my middle and exit. So the right rear and the left front we were looking at on the entry. The left rear, I'm going to look at that from the middle and the exit. If the car's too loose in the middle, I just stiffen up the left rear spring, right? If I want it to, be more loose, if it's too tight in the middle, then I'll soften it. All right, like it's really straightforward. And that's how I set my springs. Now my right front spring, I will actually start off with that at 3,600, okay? I'll start 3,600 to 4,600 depending on the track, but I start with a very stiff right front spring, all right? And I don't touch it until I get these other 3 set. Once I do that, then I'll kind of look at my right front spring and be like, okay, should I stiffen that up or soften it up, okay? So that's how I determine that. And usually what I'll do is if I think I need to soften the right front spring, I'll actually soften both of them. So if I'm like, I need to soften that right front, I need the car to be a little bit more loose on entry. I want that nose to drop just a little bit more. So instead of just being like, all right, I'm gonna take the right front from 36 to 3,000, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna drop the right front from 36 to 3,000. I'm gonna drop the left front from 26 to 2,000, right? So that's how I do it. Once again, this is just how I do it. Always, kind of try things for yourself, okay? But that's what I do for determining my spring package. Once I've got that, then I move on to my ARB adjustments, okay? Now, the ARB, all right, if you remember in the Gen 6 car, for example, we had a ton of options with the anti-roll bar. For the most part, I always ran the stiffest bar you can run. I always run a stiff bar. I'm never below 2 inches on the Xfinity or the truck or on the Gen 6 car. But with this, you've only got 2 options. You've got a 2-inch or a 1.375. That's it. Those are your 2 options. Now you do have the option to change the ARB arm, which affects the stiffness as well. So the actual diameter, that's going to be more of a major adjustment. These arms are going to be kind of a minor adjustment. I have found for me personally that I'm almost always running a 2-inch bar up front and almost always running a 1.375 in the rear. Not always, but for the most part, that's usually what I've got, okay? And so once I've got my springs, then I go out and I'll turn 10 to 15 laps and I'm seeing how the car feels, maybe 20 laps. and I'll start looking to adjust these ARB arms to kind of dial it in. Okay, once I've got that taken care of, then I move on to the next step. Okay, and once you've got those done, now we're going from short runs, kind of like 15, 10, 15 laps, to longer runs. So now when we make these adjustments, we're going to do 25, 35 lap runs. The reason for that is now that we've got a car that handles pretty good, keep in mind it's not done yet, but it handles pretty good, we're going to start dialing this thing in for the long run. All right, this is where that balancing out the tire wear and comfort are really going to come into play. The best way to do this, in my opinion, or at least the best way for me to do this, is my cross weight and my nose weight. All right, so I'm going to go out, I'm going to run 25, 30, 35 laps. I'm going to come back in and I'm going to look at my tire temperatures. Okay, if I notice that my front tires are, wearing out way more than my rear tires, well, then I need to adjust my nose weight. I probably have too much nose weight. And one thing to note about nose weight, and this was crazy when I did the test yesterday, for every 1% of nose weight increase, right? So if I went from 50% nose weight to 51% nose weight, you saw, or I should say, I saw a 1 to 2 degree increase in front tire temperature per lap. That's huge. Now, here's the thing, because most of us would look at that and be like, well, Tommy, why would we ever run nose weight? Well, here's the thing. If you've got it on the back, if you've got all the weight on the rear, guess what? It burns up the rear tires. The tire wear on these cars now, it's not like the other ones, man. I cannot reiterate that enough. You're seeing way more tire wear on all four corners of the car. So balancing that out is going to be huge. So once you've got your springs and your ARBs dialed in, you've got your caster, your cambers, your tire pressures, all right, now you're going to start looking at balancing out your tire wear. So you go out, you run 25, 30, 35 laps, come back in, and then you look at the tire wear. If you're noticing the fronts are burning up too much, then decrease the nose weight. If you notice the rears are burning up too much, increase the nose weight. All right, if you're noticing that, hey man, my left front and my right rear are wearing out way more than the right front and the left rear, then adjust your cross weight to compensate for that. All right, so that's what I do to balance out the four corners of the car in terms of my wear. And once I've got, and keep in mind, you guys, it's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be perfect. This one right here, all right, after 60 laps, for it to be where I have 3 tires within 3%, and then I've got the right rear, that, I mean, I'm going to adjust this. I'm going to actually adjust this a little bit, but to be honest, there's not a whole lot more I can get out of this, right? To be completely honest. So like, I'm super happy with that. To me, if you can keep the tires within, 5-6%, like, you've got yourself a pretty balanced car. You really do. Okay. So that's what I'm going for. And like I said, cross weight and nose weight are the best ways to do that. All right. And yes, it's tedious. It's going to take some time. All right. I trust me. I know. Okay. I've spent a lot of time, but once you do it enough, you'll get to the point where you can look at it and be like, okay, man, those are wearing way more than those. I need to do like a 2% cross weight change, right? Like you'll start figuring out like, hey man, I need to, this isn't a tweak, this is a big adjustment. All right. And once you do that, it'll be a lot quicker. Okay. Once you get that cross weight and nose weight dialed in, okay, the next thing that you're going to do is the diff preload. Now, this is something that is really, to me, driver based. All right. I did a ton of testing with this diff preload adjustment, and there was nothing that I found where this is like, you've got to use this, otherwise you're slow, or you got to turn it off, otherwise you're slow. Like, it's completely, in my opinion, 100% driver based. It's all on comfort. Okay, I treat the diff preload like stagger. All right, that's pretty much the way that it reacts. So when you're on throttle, the more preload that you have, the more the car is going to want to turn, rotate naturally on throttle. When you're off throttle, the more it's going to push, okay? The tighter it's going to be, all right? So you can actually use this to kind of fine tune the car, all right? Just keep in mind, especially when the tires wear, if you've got a ton of preload in your setup, all right? One thing that I noticed, because I did a test where I had like 50 pounds of preload and I got to like 20-25 laps. If I had my wheel turned to the left hardly at all coming out of the corner and I hit the throttle, that thing just spun on me, like just spun. So, you know, yes, springs, ARB, stuff like that can, you know, fix that in a lot of senses. But the thing that I had changed, because the car had felt perfectly fine before and wasn't doing that, the thing I changed was the diff preload. So just know that it can have a really big effect, okay, if you go crazy with it. This is one of those things that, you know, going 1 to 2 clicks at a time is plenty. You don't need to go, oh, I'm at 0 and I'm not going to go up to 50. You don't need to do that. For me, I actually always start at 0. There's a lot of times I don't even run the diff preload. Okay, I just don't like it. All right, so that's the next one. All right, after that, now you are to pretty much your final stage, okay, which is now you're gonna get this thing finished up for the final long run. And what I mean by that is the one thing that we have not adjusted is our shocks. Now the shocks can be really complex for people. All right, we've got, and I covered this in the video I did on these shocks. We've got all these adjustments and people can look at that and they're just like, dude, what am I supposed to do? The easiest way for those of you who are like, whether you're intimidated by this or you get overwhelmed by all these adjustments, is this. If it has an HS next to it, leave it at 5. You don't need to adjust it, all right? You don't. Leave it at 5. The only ones you need to adjust are the LS, the low speed. If you look here in this guide, I've got breakdowns for the different adjustments. If you look at the shocks, these are all low speed adjustments. So for example, if you want to, you know, loosen up the exit of the car, you can increase the bump, which in this case that's the low speed compression. You would just increase that. All right, that's what you would do. That's going to take the setup pretty much to its final form, right? Because when at this point, when you've got all the shocks set at 5, you're about 75-80% of the way there, maybe 85%. That last 15-20% is going to be the shocks, and that's what's going to really dial in that comfort and control. Now, once you get the low speed stuff set, then for those of you who will adjust the high speed, that's what you'll adjust next, is the high speed. Now, remember, low speed is the transient normal movements. That's, you know, letting off the throttle and the car setting, right? Weight shifting front, rolling into the gas and the weight shifting to the back, right? Those are low speed movements. High speed movements, those are bumps, curbs, right? You got a rough track. Think of Dover, when you come up out of the corner and you come up over that hump, right? That's an actual high, you would use a high speed shock adjustment for that, all right, to help control that. Yes, the low speed will have an effect on it, but the high speed is what will really help you get the car to be really good over stuff like that, right? If you look at really bumpy tracks, look at California, right? That track's super rough in a lot of places. Or even like Charlotte, right? There's quite a few bumps there. Iowa's got huge bumps on it. That's the high speed stuff, the high speed compression and the high speed rebound. You're going to use those to deal with that stuff. And then you've got the high speed compression slope and the high speed rebound slope. And that's going to really control the platform of the car on each corner. All right. So remember, the higher the number on the slope, right? What that's doing is that's adjusting the curve of the slope. It's making it a lot more digressive, right? In simplest terms, the higher that this number is, the less that corner of the car is going to move. All right, which is not always a good thing, right? We want the shocks to work if it's a really bumpy track. If that corner of the car is not moving, it might be too stiff. especially with cars like this. You go into a corner and you hit the brake, and all of a sudden that the left front chatters a little bit because it's hitting bumps, and then boom, you lock up, okay? Or you hit some bumps and now the thing's out of control. So it's a balance with these high speed adjustments. All right, the compression, the high speed rebound, and then the compression and rebound slopes as well. But like I said a second ago, if you are not comfortable adjusting those, don't. Leave them all at 5 and just do the low speed. And I promise you, you'll still have a very, very good setup. All right. Now, if you're, a Coke series driver, right? Like if you're one of those guys, then you want to learn how to adjust the high speed stuff. But for the most part, everybody else, you really don't have to mess with it. You don't. Okay. Like I do, but I use Motec, and Motec allows me to adjust that stuff super simple. All right. Not everybody uses Motec. Most people don't want to use Motec, right? So just, you can leave them at 5 and move on with it. All right. And you will, like I said, you will have a good setup. You can see most of my stuff, and this goes for a lot of my setups that I do, unless it's an extreme with the track. Most of my stuff, I'm within the range of like, 3 to 7 on most of the adjustments. It's not like, my slopes are at 10 and my high speed or my low speed stuff's at 1. It's not like that. Like it's all relatively close usually. These are really fine-tuned adjustments, and these shocks, unlike the old shocks on the Gen 6 car, these shocks actually make a difference. When you make a shock adjustment, you feel it, which was not really the case with the old car. Like you felt it a little bit, right? But for the most part, you just kind of, on the Gen 6 car, I ran halves on most stuff, right? I would either run like 0, 16, or 32. Those were my 3 settings on the shock. So a simple adjustment, even one click, you can actually feel the difference. All right. So that is the shocks. And once you've got that done, you're ready to go. You're ready to go. You've got yourself a race setup. Now you just go out and you do a full length run. Go out and run 40, 50, 60 laps and come back in and see how the car felt over that run, and then look at your tire wear and see how the balance is. And if things are close and you're like, man, that actually felt pretty good, then you're good to go. I mean, you really are. All right. Now, if you want to, if you're like, man, I think I need to get a little bit more downforce, and you can play with the rake a little bit, right? Or maybe you're like, maybe I got too much downforce. You can actually flatten it out a little bit, see if you can reduce a little bit of drag, right? It's completely up to you, but that's going to be how you build that setup. And then everything after that is really just fine tuning what you've got. And I mean, that you can spend a ton of time doing, but like I always talk about when it comes to setups, right? The 80-20 rule. 20% of your initial adjustments is going to give you 80% of your results. That's why we start with the springs, because it's such a big deal. You can get those right. Everything else, I mean, unless you've got your car like 6 inches off the ground, right? Like everything else is just gravy. It really is. It's icing on the cake. If you can get the springs right, then maybe you might need to adjust a couple other things, maybe nose weight, cross weight, to kind of balance it out, and you'll have something that's good. It might not be 10,000 I rating, strength of field, race winning good, but it's gonna be good for most splits, right? Like it will be if you're good at driving it. So don't get caught up in the tiny little stuff trying to find thousandths of a second. Get the car to feel comfortable, get out there, turn some laps, and get good at being smooth and consistent over the long run, because that, in my opinion, is what's really going to separate the field with these cars now. Because like I said, when these tires wear, you can feel it, and you can feel it in a big, big way. So you want this thing to be balanced. Now, a couple things to note really quick here about the setup guide before we wrap this up. I do have some quick adjustments here just for whether if you're doing a race or maybe you're in a practice and the car's doing something and you've got it, this setup is, it's a setup you've already built, and now it's the track temperature is different, or maybe the track rating or the track state is higher or lower, something like that. Now all of a sudden that setup's doing something that it wasn't doing before. These are quick adjustments. These are kind of like my go-to adjustments for this car. So you can just see here, tight on exit, then you want to do one of these adjustments, go back out and test, right? It's pretty simple. Now, once you've got your race setup, the next is the qualifying setup. I got to be honest with you, when it comes to building a qualifying setup, there's not a whole lot you can do with these cars. There just isn't. We don't tape off the nose, right? Taping off the nose with the other cars is one of the big deals. It's one of the reasons why you build a qualifying setup, because taping that off can save you a ton of time, especially on one of these 1.5 tracks. It can save you a half a second just taping off the nose in terms of speed, right? That's not counting the fact that how different the car is going to handle and stuff like that. So because we don't have that, building qualifying setups, there's not a whole lot that you can do. For me, all that I do is I'll just be really aggressive with my cambers. So I'll kind of just max out the cambers, so that way the car will just turn in better so I can carry more speed. And then I'll usually just adjust my cross weight and my nose weight to tighten the car up, because now it's going to be pretty loose since I adjusted those cambers, went aggressive on them, to tighten it up and then test it and see. And usually the qualifying setup might be, a couple tenths faster, maybe, a tenth, 2/10 faster. I mean, that's about the most you can get out of it. I mean, it really is. You might be able to get a little bit more depending on the track, but overall, you're not going to save a ton of time with the qualifying setup. Because of this, if you build a good race setup and you're just like, yeah, I don't want to do qualifying setups, just qualify with your race setup. Now, if your race setup is built for the long run, which is what I always do and what I'm kind of teaching you to do here, or I shouldn't say teaching, but showing you how to do, then if you use that to qualify, it might suck a little bit. So you might want to go in and adjust it, just do a couple of quick adjustments to make it faster in the short run. But overall, that's it, man. I mean, it really is for the qualifying setup. There's not much to it. Now, lastly, adjusting for weather and track conditions. These are really my go-to adjustments for doing that on these cars. On like the Xfinity or the Trek or something, my go-to adjustments for that is the track bar. Like the track, it's super simple. If the track is 10 degrees hotter, drop that track bar down like a quarter to a half an inch on both sides and you're good to go, right? It's really simple. With these cars, not so much. It's a little bit different, because, there's times I've found if I go if I built the setup and let's say the track temp was 90 degrees and then I show up for the race and now it's 112, okay? It might not be the same adjustment at a Las Vegas than it is at, a Kentucky, right? I mean, it's just not. So sometimes it's cross weight, sometimes it's nose weight, sometimes it's an ARB adjustment, sometimes it's a shock adjustment. It just kind of depends. But these are really my go-tos for that. Yes, I will change springs sometimes to compensate for weather, but it's really rare. I normally only do that if one of these is not working, and the chances of that happening is usually slim to none. Okay, so that's kind of how I compensate for the weather. And you guys, that's it, man. That's the guide. It's pretty straightforward. It'll show you, like I said, step by step kind of how to do it. It explains everything for you and breaks it down. And you want to just get out there and turn laps. Turn laps, get a good feel for it, work on being smooth. Don't just stomp the throttle. Roll in, roll out, nice and smooth. Okay? And then once you do that, then you can start making adjustments, testing and comparing. And if you do that and you follow that guide, you should be able to build yourself some comfortable, racy setups. All right? Because so far I've gone through those steps a bunch of times, not just here at Kentucky, but other tracks, and it's worked for me great. So hopefully it'll do the same thing for you. All right, you guys, so that's going to do it all for this video. Now, really quick, do me a favor, if you like this, hit that like button. You know what to do. And then also, if you're not subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. It helps us out, but also it'll let you know when I post more stuff like this, whether it's a live stream or another setup guide or anything, right? So hit that subscribe button. Make sure that you join the channel, because like I said, I got a lot of stuff that I'm putting out. And then like I said, if you like it, hit that like button. Also, if you want to get the setup guide, all right, it's completely free. It's on the website now. All you got to do is go to schoolofsimracing.net, click on the button that says join community, and when you do that, it'll put you into the free membership site. You'll get access to the free membership site. You'll receive an email, it'll give you your login information. You just go to the free membership site, and then in that free membership site, it'll say setup guides. Go over to setup guides and you'll see it. NASCAR NextGen setup guide 2022. It's right there. So if you want to get that, that's how you do it. I'll have a link for everything down in the description below. And then also, if you want to learn more. We talked about the shocks and the high speed adjustments, stuff like that. If you want to actually dive into that more and learn more about that, I've got a video that I covered the shocks in depth. I'll put a link for that down in the description below, and then maybe one here on the screen somewhere so you can click on it. But that way, if you want to learn more about the shocks, you can do that as well, because for me, they're a really key factor. And although, like I said, you could just set them at 5 and leave them alone and be very, very good, I like to get everything out of my car that I can. And so for me, it's worth it to sit there and tinker with the shocks for hours. Sometimes that's what happens. But anyways, you guys, that's going to do it. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this helps you. If you got any questions or anything like that, you guys know where to find me. SSR Discord, just shoot me a message in there. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. You don't have to you don't have to schedule a one-on-one session or something like that for me to help you, right? That's what the community is here for. That's what we try to do. So if you need help or anything like that, just hit me up, hit someone up in the community. There's a ton of people there willing to help you at all times of the day. It does not matter. There's always someone there willing to help you. All right. But once again, thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate you being here. I hope this works for you. I hope this helps you. And until next time, good luck, good racing, take care.